a result of this survey, and it's a great honor to have these canoe makers and birch bark folks with us. But before we begin, I wanted to turn it over to Stu Kestenbaum, who is going to present some awards.
You've done very well this year in school. So my name is Stuart Kestenbaum, and I'm a senior advisor to Monson Arts. And when we were first envisioning the program at Monson Arts, we wanted it to be a place for arts and creativity for people that come from all over to work in studios in Monson, but at the same time to recognize the culture and heritage that's been here all along. And this is a manifestation of it. To do this project, we got a grant from the Folk Arts Program of the National Endowment for the Arts. And I need you to do something. Should I hold the microphone?
Okay.
Oh. You want the stand
This is like the Beatles. No, you just get the microphone close to me. Or can you hear me if I speak like this? Is that loud enough?
Yeah.
All right, I'm good.
Okay.
Good. So, first of all, looking at the water and looking at the canoes, I want to acknowledge that we're situated on the homeland of the Wabanaki people, and we recognize and honor the Wabanaki, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq tribes who stewarded this land and its waterways through the generations and acknowledge their inherent sovereignty in this territory. And nothing manifests this more, I think, than the canoe making tradition. The state doesn't have many awards that it gives out. We're just an understated state, I guess you could say. But we wanted to recognize the incredible work that these makers have done. So we have a legislative sentiment that we'd like to present. It was passed by the state legislature this year. And I'll just read it to you. Each person is going to get one of these. I'm not going to hand them out now because you'll have to, then you have to hold it. But
Do you want me to hold the microphone?
I think I can just, I'm not loud enough like this. Yeah. Steve Kerr, Ron Thurlow, Barry Dana. Raise your hand when I say your name. Jerry Stelmach, Alexandra Conover Bennett. And it's such an incredible tradition within Maine, and a beautiful and functional work. And this is what was passed by the legislature, recognizing each of these makers' craft and skill as a canoe maker or paddle maker. And of the Northwoods region, the Wabanaki tradition has been sustained for centuries by Wabanaki and Northwoods makers whose creativity, skill, knowledge of materials, design, and construction serve as a model for future makers and for generations to come. So thank you. I don't represent the state, but I did carry these up here. But I think that's a genuine manifestation of our acknowledgement of the incredible work that you've done. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I think that's a testimony to how special this region is, that going back to when the Wabanaki first started making canoes to now, that there really are exceptional makers in our midst that work out of small studios, and maybe you don't know about, but this is really a hub for canoe making, paddle making, and birch bark work in the whole country. So we're going to start with Barry Dana, who is the former chief of the Penobscots and is an extremely talented birch bark artist and has worked on birch bark canoes. And he's going to give us an overview of the Wabanaki connection to canoe making. Do you want to stand up there? Okay.
Well, if Stu could do it, I think I can do it.
Oh, without the microphone? Okay.
If you don't already have the ability to add 2 + 2 = 4, then you don't have the ability to recognize the connection between Wabanaki people and our canoe traditions and what it means to us. So is there anybody that does not already have that concept? Because I don't have to go too deep into it, But obviously, you all got here by a motor vehicle more than likely. The canoe has always been our mode of transportation. So it just makes sense that we would be making canoes in an area that had a lot of water. And we did that for however long it took for us to figure out how to manipulate nature into this particular functional thing that we could use to carry people, carry our provisions, go hunting, go traveling, go visiting family members up and down the rivers, down to the coast, and you name it. So being Penobscot, it's been my opportunity and my responsibility and my love to try to understand what my ancestors did. And I've come to find out there's a lot of misunderstandings. Misunderstandings that get passed down generation to generation, which becomes an institutionalized numbing of the real, of the truth. My life has taken me on a path where I've uncovered or demystified or debunked things, like putting our birchbark wigwam in a canoe and nomadically moving 800 people from one village down to the ocean. Okay, let's try to make a little sense of that, right? All of a sudden, it doesn't make any sense when you've made a wigwam, when you've made a canoe. So I got my start making a canoe because the shop teacher at the island school that I was teaching at the Penobscot Reservation challenged me to making a birchbark canoe race. There was a race to make a canoe. And I said, well, I've never made a canoe, but I'm not going to let any white guy beat me. So I make a canoe. I didn't have a clue. I didn't even know how to begin to start. So what does that really mean for Native people not to have a clue about a tradition that we've been doing thousands of years? That's a pretty sad fact, isn't it? Talk about colonization, talk about being oppressed, forced onto a reservation, cut off from our ancestral territories. So I would hope you would internalize that. What is it like for Native people to actually not know our traditions? Because survival meant adopting the colonist way of life. And canoes no longer made themselves, once the canvas came in, once the plastic came in, and now that, you just adapt, you just keep adapting. So I tried to make a canoe. No knowledge. And it never saw the water, but it saw my wood stove. Bark and cedar is the best kindling you can have, right? So I then picked up the book, Adney's book. I went to New Hampshire and met with
Henry
what's that white guy's name?
Henry Belcourt.
Yeah, Henry. Yeah. And Henry gave us bogus instructions because he was busy. He didn't want any visits. But I saw somebody way the hell down there, back when I had good eyesight, doing this. It was not the directions he gave us. So anyway, I found Henry. And when he found out, he didn't know I was Penobscot. As soon as he found out, he dropped everything he was doing. He spent the whole day with me. He was getting ready to go to Europe for some big flight tour or whatever. That really sealed my passion for wanting to learn to make a canoe. So I made another one. But I was pretty confident that I could do this, so I invited 6 middle school boys to my house, and we made a canoe. We took it back to the reservation, and we did a grand launching, because their parents showed up, a couple of community members showed up, and it was one of the biggest moments of cultural revitalization. We had kids paddling in the birchbark canoe on our Penobscot's river. Did you catch that little? Good. Then time goes by. I want to master this art now. This is really in my blood. And a school from Wellington, Maine, came to the reservation and to ask me questions about culture. But every question was answered by this little 4th grade girl. And I'm going, "Who are you?" It was Steve's daughter. She knew all these answers. What the heck? So that gets Steve and I together, and he and I did some projects together, and I started picking up on various parts of the process, never really going from start to finish, until I become chief. Now I can get some money from all these people and say, "Steve, would you do us a canoe on the reservation?" He did. Basically gave up his entire summer on our behalf to bring something that we have struggled to bring back. And he had the knowledge, he had the willingness to come to the island, and we made a birch bark canoe. He says, I only ask that we have 6 serious people. What do we end up with, 20? Right? So people, we built it in a spot on the reservation where people driving by could see it, and people were driving, stopping all day, every day. And then we had a grand launching that was a little more organized than the very first one we had years before. Oh, when I did that canoe with the kids, somebody standing there said, we haven't seen a birch bark canoe in this water for 60 years. Yeah, so it's a big deal for them. So Steve comes along, and now we make a canoe that is way more functional, and it was a big celebration, big ceremonial time for Native people. You know, even if they didn't touch it, the fact that it was here, the fact that they could see what our traditions were, how it really looks, was a real big deal for Native people on Penobscot Nation. Very next day, this was why we made this canoe. It wasn't to go stick on a wall somewhere. It was to use it. The very next day, that canoe was used by the people who made it in relay, paddling it from Penobscot Nation Island. I'm not using that word Indian anymore. No more colonized BS. Penobscot Nation home, upriver to Canoe. Took 3 days, people paddling it. I didn't paddle it because we had so many paddlers, plus my wife and I paddled together, but on the Debskinig Portage, I got to carry it. And it was quite a moment, walking in the same path that my ancestors had walked, carried their canoes for thousands of years. That's pretty powerful. That's what this canoe means to me. It's not an art. It's not something to be hung on a wall. It's something to be made, to be used. But we don't need these canoes anymore, right? There's modern stuff now. When you make the canoe, when you get your hands all calloused up, when you get dirty, when you get minges all over you because you dig your roots, you become connected to the culture. It's not about the canoe. It's about the culture. That's what separates Native people and non-Native people from these type of things. These are our identity, who we are as Native people. So that's why we never have given up on revitalizing our past, because it really empowers our present. Was that 10 minutes? That sounded like a good end.
I'm not going to use that microphone. Thank you, Barry. Next is Steve Kayard, who is from Wellington, who is a birch bark canoe maker, and Barry referenced Steve's work with working with Native communities on birch bark canoe making. So, would you like to use the microphone?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Barry, for mentioning that. I was going to do the same. Barry and I met in the early 90s, and I had been building canoes for a little while in Wellington, but that was my first canoe then. I built one other one in Massachusetts, but yeah, birch bark canoe building for me has been just an outgrowth of spending time in the woods, which I've done all my life, and I pretty much, from the time I was in high school, spent most of the time either in the woods or in the library studying the woods, and that led me to a study of traditional Native culture as being an expression of a life lived in community with the woods, and using natural materials for everyday needs, and that's something that very much attracted me, so the canoe building was an outgrowth of that. never really had a teacher per se of canoe building, but I want to stress that it's a very old body of knowledge that I drew on, and as Barry said, for thousands of years, this is something that was developed here in the North Woods from everyday use. And so even though I didn't have one teacher of canoe building, I had thousands of teachers, because everybody I talked to, I learned something from, and I learned a lot from all the books that were written on the subject, and from old canoes that are still in existence. And then that time in the early 90s when Barry and I got together, it all kind of made sense, as he said, from a cultural viewpoint. He did the honor of inviting me to teach what I had learned to the native people to whom that technology belonged. And that was the greatest compliment anybody could pay me, to consider the work that I was doing as being representative of that native tradition. So I started a series of projects on Indian Island and also in the Maliseet communities in New Brunswick on the Holistic River. So there was a feeling of continuation of that culture. And I have to say, the other members of this panel too have been a great help to me as well. Roland visited me when I had built that canoe in the early 90s and gave me a recommendation at the Wooden Boat School. And that was a big break for me to teach there for a few years. And I never really, I don't know if I ever really could have started as a professional canoe builder without that. And Jerry too has over the years given me, sent referrals to me and been a big support to me in many different ways as well. And Alexandra as well, sending me referrals and commissioning and training. So I never would have gotten anywhere without these people right here. And of course at the Wooden Boat School I also met David Moses Bridges, who was a dear friend of mine and became a dear friend of mine. He took my class there one year and then apprenticed with me and worked with me, and we collaborated on many different projects in the Native communities and elsewhere, and spent a great deal of time in the woods together gathering materials. And he opened a lot of doors for me as well, so I had a lot of help. And but I missed Moses, but we lost him all too soon 5 years ago. Anyway, I'm glad that the woods are still doing what they're doing, and we can still learn from the woods. The woods are the ultimate teacher, and paying attention to what's going on out there is the best way to learn. And the materials will guide you and inspire you. There's nothing like the natural world. It's a magical place.
Thank
No, I think I can talk. Yeah, but if you can't hear me, just raise your hand or wave or something like that. So I was going to just talk a little bit about the history of wooden canvas canoes. And when I started using wooden canvas canoes way back in the 60s when I was growing up and doing the rivers, I would think, boy, this has to be the oldest canoe in the world, you know, just, you know, not knowing anything, but, you know, I just said, this has to be around forever. And so then later on in life, when I got involved in boat building and canoe building, say, well, I really want to research this more and find out more about the history. And I found out that really, wooden canvas canoes really weren't developed until about the 1870s. And they didn't really get into really broad use or wide use until the 1900s. And so it was, and so I said, well, you know, 1870s or something. I didn't really know that at the time. I said, but I knew it was sometime in the 1800s, late 1800s. I said, well, it'll be easy to search out the relatives of these old canoe makers, the Old Town Canoe and E.M. White, and Old Town Canoes in Old Town. E.M. White was also in Old Town, and the Morris Company was at Vesey. They were all big companies. I said, this, no sweat, you know, you go find grandchildren, children or great-grandchildren, and you go searching, you know. E.M. White came from a family of like, he had, you know, 7 or 8 brothers or sisters, you know. E.M. White, turns out, he didn't have any children. So kind of a dead end there, you know. And so then you go to the Morris Company. Morris, he came from a family of 5 kids, 5 brothers and sisters. You go to his family and no relatives. And you go to the Garish family from Brownville. I don't know how many brothers and sisters there. You know, there's Garishes all over here. You know, no relative or no direct descendants. And so it turns out that one of the chemicals that they used to use in covering the canvas on the wood, or covering the canvas on the canoe, was white lead. Made real good. It was real tough, but yet it had flexibility. You could drag it over rocks. It was really good. And then I kind of found out talking to the OSHA people. You know, one of the side effects of lead overdose is sterility. And so all these people that had worked in the shops back then, or not all, but many did not have children. You find out the relatives of the Old Town Canoe Company and the Chestnut Canoe Company in New Brunswick, Canada. Their owners, they did have children and good families, but those owners never worked in the factory. They weren't working on the canoe. So, and about that time when Jerry and I were getting started building, you know, we said, I wish we had this lead filler, you know, it was so good, you know. And then after we found that out, we said, well, you know, having the replacements that we have working with now today really aren't that bad. But anyway, so I was looking around for relatives, couldn't find anything. It was really hard to trace down. And you would think, well, you go to the library, find some research about it, or books or old magazine articles and things like that. And I tell you, these old canoe builders, they were tight-lipped. They weren't going to let anybody know their secrets. And they all claimed to be the first on everything. And they all claimed to have the best of everything. But they wouldn't tell anybody how they did anything. There just was nothing. You'd say, well, you find a book on building the canvas canoe. Boy, I found that down at the Wooden Boat Library. And I said, eureka, I found, you know, building the wooden canvas boat. You know, it was really how to build a kayak, a European kayak with a wood frame and cover it with canvas. You know, nothing like these boats. And so it was just nothing. But anyway, so through just digging and putting things together, and you find old catalogs and you find the dates that the people started building and everything. And it seemed to be E.H. Garish, which was from Brownville, had one of the earliest, if not the earliest, canoe company making wooden canvas canoes, and that was about late 1870s. And he was down in Bangor, from Brownville, but ended up in building in Bangor. And so then later on, and so all of these canoes I've been mentioning, the Old Towns and the E.M. Whites and the Garish, you know, they all started basically copying, you know, the Micmac and Penobscot and Passamaquoddy canoes. You know, they were just copying those styles because those styles worked, and they worked in Maine, and you know, that's what people wanted. You know, and so there was no reason to, you know, there wasn't reinventing the wheel or design. It was just the form of construction. And so later on, we did find an article written about 1906, and it was about a trip that E.H. Garish had made. A lumber surveyor, wanted to take a trip to Ottawa because there was a lumbering operation. He was in Brownville, or he was in Milo, and needed to get to Ottawa. So he hired Garish to take him up there, and Garish had the choice of 2 canoes to take the trip on. One was, in the article, it said a tin canoe. And I'm not sure what that must have looked like or been like, but it probably was not very useful. And the other canoe, they said, was a canvas canoe. And so this was very interesting. It was the first time, you know, a real mention of a canvas canoe, and it said it was built similar to the style being used today. And so that was in 1906, and by then the wooden canvas canoe was very popular. So it was based on that same construction method, which is quite opposite, the same shape of canoe, or similar shapes of canoes, as a birch bark canoe, but built very different. The birch bark canoe, or Jared will talk about this more, right?
Really?
Yeah, you will. You will. And so the birch bark canoe, you start basically with the bark, and you kind of form it like a canoe shape, and then you insert wood into it. In a wooden canvas canoe, the bark canoe also does not have a form. Basically, doesn't have any form. You're doing this by eye and experience. And with a wooden canvas canoe, you're starting with a form. A solid form, so you know what your canoe is going to look like and everything. And you start with the wood on the wood. You shape the wood first, and then you cover it with canvas. So it's a very different European style of building method. Kind of adapting the European style of building method to the shape of the birch bark canoe. But anyway, so Garish kind of developed this system of new type of system of building building a wooden canvas canoe, using a form, bending the ribs, nailing the ribs together, nailing the ribs and planking together, and then covering it with canvas. And he was a guide, main guide, and then he moved to Bangor and started this canoe company, or he was building fishing rods and canoes. And then from there, Bean and Morris from Vesey, the family was they'd been making wooden carriages. He kind of saw these wooden canoes, and he could adapt his, you know, building methods or knowledge into making wooden canvas canoes. So he got started in Vesey about 1880. Just very soon after Garish, and then E.M. White saw a Garish canoe on the Penobscot River, and he thought he could copy that, and so he got started in the mid-1880s, and Old Town was seeing that success. And Old Town got started about 1903, and so by the mid-1900s, the wooden canvas canoe became much more popular, or it became popular because you could mass produce these items, and you could cover them with canvas, and you didn't have to go in the woods and get birch bark, and it was a lot easier to do, and you could put out a lot more of them, and so people could afford to use them. 1920s came, and the Roaring Twenties, and it was the Roaring Twenties for wooden canoes. You see pictures of canoes the canoe clubs, all the canoe clubs. You see pictures on the Charles River in Boston, and they had several big canoe clubs down there that would have hundreds of canoes in storage, and people would go out on the rivers and the Charles River and just socialize on canoes. You'd see big pictures of men all dressed up in their coats and ties and hats, and the women with big dresses on and parasols and Victrola in the canoe. And one reason it was so popular was you could actually go dating in the canoe, you know, a man and a woman alone together in the canoe, you know, which they couldn't be alone together anyplace else. But in the canoe they could be. And so that's a pretty popular thing. So then became the war, and so, or World War I, but canoe, wooden canvas canoes kept their popularity right up till the late 50s. And all of a sudden, fiberglass, you know, started being invented. After the war, tin canoes, aluminum canoes became very popular. Alcoa was, you know, made a lot of planes during the World War II, and producing a lot of aluminum for the canoes. And even as the war was winding down in 44, 45, they were looking for different markets. What are they going to do with all this aluminum that they could make? And one of them discovered they could actually shape it like a canoe. And so after the war, aluminum canoes became real popular. In the 50s, fiberglass started to come in, and by the 60s, almost all those old canoe companies died out, replaced by fiberglass. Old Town had shifted to making fiberglass canoes, and then I forgot the date. By 1972, Old Town. 77. Old Town decided they were basically going to stop making wooden canoes anymore and just go strictly to fiberglass. They would keep the wood. They would keep a little bit of wood production going just because they could say that they could have the wood production. But they had, you know, they made thousands and thousands of canoes, and they had these forms. I don't know how many forms they had, but they probably had 40 or 50 forms of different shapes and styles of canoes. They didn't need them anymore. They took them to the dump and burned it. Old Town dump, except for about 4 or 5 of the forms, and they kept those. So the industry was pretty much dead. Wooden canvas canoes all around Maine. You could find, you know, somebody here or there, an old trapper, an old guide making canoes. And so by the 70s, when Jerry and I were interested in canoe making, it was almost like reinventing the wheel again. But you know, through the 70s and 80s, there was a big back to the land movement, and Wooden Boat magazine came out, and people started being interested again in the history of these things, and just the craftsmanship that it takes to make one of these boats. And since we've been at it since the late 70s, and it's a very, very small industry, one-man shops, or two-man shops, and Jerry and I think I guess we probably represent the largest canoe making, wooden canvas canoe making builders in the world. There's a few here. But that's basically a short history of wooden canvas canoes.
Thank you. That was no easy feat to condense all of that into. That was wonderful. Thank you. Next is Jerry Stallman, who is
Spelling it wrong all
I know. Trouble with the last letter. Jerry's name.
quiz after that.
See what it says on